The story begins on a humid summer night in Chicago, deep in the gritty heart of the South Side. The air is thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke as Clara Evans steps into a rundown bar, her arms weighed down by a crate of bottled water. At 21, Clara is a medical student at the University of Illinois, Chicago, but tonight she's just a delivery girl, working late to scrape together enough money for tuition. Her faded jeans and worn-out sneakers mark her as an outsider in this dimly lit world of rough voices and clinking glasses. She moves quickly, weaving through the crowd, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes scanning the room for the bartender who ordered the water. Somewhere in the chaos, a drunken man with bloodshot eyes watches her from a corner booth. He's a regular here, a leering shadow who's been waiting for a chance like this. With a sly grin, he pulls a small vial from his pocket and pours a clear liquid into one of the water bottles Clara set down on the bar. The drug dissolves instantly, leaving no trace, and he leans back, satisfied, expecting her to take a sip any moment. But Clara doesn't notice. She's too busy arguing with the bartender about the payment, her voice sharp with frustration as she demands the $10 she's owed. She sets the tampered bottle aside, distracted, and turns away to grab her crate. Across town, in the polished glow of Chicago's Gold Coast, James Sullivan is a man on edge. At 29, he's the CEO of Sullivan Industries, a real estate empire that towers over the city's skyline. Tonight, though, he's not in his sleek office or his sprawling mansion. He's sitting in the passenger seat of a black SUV, staring out at the neon lights of the South Side. His assistant, Tom Reed, a wiry man with a knack for talking James into things, is behind the wheel. James runs a hand through his dark hair, his sharp jaw clenched tight. He's here because Tom insisted he needed a break, a night to drown the stress that's been eating at him since the accident. "You've been a ghost since that crash, boss," Tom says, his voice light but firm. "One drink won't kill you." James doesn't argue. He's too tired to fight it. The bar is loud and chaotic when James steps inside, his tailored jacket out of place among the faded flannel shirts and scuffed boots. He keeps his head down, avoiding the curious stares, and heads straight for the bar. That's when he sees it, the lone water bottle sitting unattended on the counter. He's parched from the humid night, and without a second thought, he grabs it, twists off the cap, and takes a long gulp. The bitter taste hits him almost instantly, but he shrugs it off, thinking it's just cheap water. Within minutes, his vision blurs, and a strange heat floods his body. He stumbles, gripping the edge of the bar, his mind slipping into a haze. Clara, still waiting for her money, turns just in time to see James stagger toward her. She doesn't know who he is, only that he's tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that doesn't belong in a place like this. Before she can react, he grabs her wrist, his grip firm but unsteady, and pulls her toward a shadowed corner of the bar. Her heart races as she tries to yank free, but his strength overwhelms her. "Let go," she snaps, her voice lost in the noise of the crowd. He doesn't hear her. He's not himself anymore, lost in the drug's grip, his eyes wild and unfocused. What happens next is a blur for both of them. They end up in a cheap motel room a block away, the kind with flickering neon signs and stained carpets. The night unravels in a tangle of confusion and instinct, driven by the drug coursing through James's veins. Clara fights to stay conscious, her mind screaming at her to escape, but exhaustion and fear pull her under. Hours pass in silence, the world outside fading into the hum of the city. When morning breaks, Clara wakes first, her head pounding as sunlight streams through a cracked window. She's lying on a lumpy mattress, her clothes wrinkled and askew, and beside her is James, still asleep, his breathing slow and heavy. Panic claws at her chest as she pieces together the night. She doesn't know his name, only that he's someone important, someone who doesn't belong in her world. Her hands tremble as she slips out of bed, grabs her shoes, and flees the room without looking back. The cold Chicago air hits her like a slap as she stumbles onto the street, tears stinging her eyes. Back at home, a cramped apartment in South Side, Clara barely has time to catch her breath before Rita storms in. "Where's the money?" her mother demands, her voice sharp as a blade. Rita's a wiry woman with hard lines etched into her face, her eyes narrowed with greed. When Clara admits she didn't get paid, Rita's hand cracks across her cheek, sending her reeling. "Useless girl!" Rita spits, shoving her toward the kitchen. "You're nothing but a burden." Clara bites back a sob, her mind still reeling from the night, the stranger and the fear of what might come next. Meanwhile, James wakes alone in the motel, his head throbbing and his memory a blank slate. The room is empty, the bed cold beside him. He sits up, rubbing his temples, trying to make sense of the fog in his mind. His jacket lies crumpled on the floor, his wallet untouched, but something feels wrong. "What the hell happened last night?" he mutters, his voice rough with confusion. He staggers to his feet, grabs his phone, and calls Tom to pick him up, the question burning in his mind. He has no idea that a single night, a single mistake, has just set his life on a collision course with Clara's. A few weeks before that chaotic night in the South Side bar, James Sullivan's life took a sharp turn on a rain-slick stretch of Lakeshore Drive. It was late, the city lights blurring through the windshield of his sleek black Porsche, and he was driving home from a company gala at Sullivan Industries. The champagne had flowed too freely that night, a rare lapse for a man who prided himself on control. His foot pressed too hard on the gas, the car hydroplaned, and in a heartbeat, it spun off the road, crashing into a guardrail with a sickening crunch of metal. The airbag saved his life, but the headlines the next day screamed disaster. Chicago's golden boy in near-fatal wreck. James walked away with bruises and a fractured wrist, but whispers spread fast through the city's elite circles. They said the accident left him broken in ways the doctors couldn't fix, that the Sullivan family's hope for an heir was gone forever. In the weeks that followed, James retreated into himself, his days confined to the sprawling mansion in Chicago's Gold Coast. The house was a fortress of wealth, all marble floors and towering windows with views of Lake Michigan, but it felt more like a cage. At 29, he was the CEO of Sullivan Industries, a real estate empire his grandfather built from nothing. The company owned half the skyline, from gleaming skyscrapers to luxury condos, but lately, James couldn't shake the weight of it all. He sat in his study, staring at the city he ruled, his dark eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The accident replayed in his mind, not the crash itself, but the nagging sense that he'd lost something he couldn't name. His mother, Eleanor Sullivan, watched him with growing unease. She was a woman of steel and grace, her silver hair always pinned neatly, her presence commanding every room she entered. The Sullivan name meant everything to her, a legacy forged through decades of grit and ambition. At first, she gave James space, trusting he'd bounce back like he always did. But as the weeks dragged on and he grew more distant, her worry turned to quiet panic. She'd catch him staring out the window, lost in thought, and her mind raced to the rumors. What if they were true? What if her only son couldn't give her the grandchildren she dreamed of, the ones who'd carry the Sullivan torch? One evening, she cornered him in the dining room, her voice soft but firm. "James, you've been through hell, I know that. But we can't let this family fade away. You need to think about the future." He brushed her off, his jaw tight. "I'm not marrying some socialite just to please you, Mom. I'd rather be alone than trapped." Eleanor didn't push further that night, but the seed was planted, her concern deepening with every passing day. Meanwhile, miles away in the crumbling edges of South Side, Clara Evans lived a different kind of prison. Her world was a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a leaky roof, shared with her mother, Rita Evans. At 21, Clara was chasing a dream that felt impossibly far, becoming a doctor. She'd earned a spot at the University of Illinois Chicago through sheer determination, piecing together scholarships and late-night jobs to cover the rest. Her hands were calloused from years of scrubbing dishes and delivering water, her nights spent hunched over textbooks by the dim glow of a second-hand lamp. She was small but fierce, her dark hair often falling into her eyes as she studied, her mind sharp despite the exhaustion. Rita, though, saw none of that. To her, Clara was a means to an end, a ticket out of the poverty that had chained her to Southside for decades. She was a wiry woman, her face etched with bitterness, her voice a constant lash. "You think that fancy school's gonna save you?" she'd sneer, snatching the few dollars Clara brought home from her delivery runs. "You're nothing without me, girl. Keep working, or we're out on the street." Clara learned early to keep her head down, to swallow the anger that burned in her chest. She'd lie awake at night, dreaming of a white coat and a stethoscope, a life where she could heal instead of hurt. But Rita's grip was iron, and every step Clara took toward freedom felt like a battle she might not win. 2 lives, 2 worlds, divided by wealth and circumstance, yet tethered by a single night neither of them could fully recall. James, restless and haunted, agreed to Tom's suggestion for a night out, hoping to shake the gloom that clung to him. Clara, desperate for cash, took on one more delivery shift, her fate hinging on a crate of water and a bar she'd never choose to enter. They were strangers, their paths never meant to cross, but Chicago had other plans. That night in the bar had already happened, its echoes rippling through their lives, setting the stage for a collision neither could foresee. James stepped out of the SUV that night, his mind a tangle of frustration and fatigue, while Clara pushed through the bar's doors, her heart heavy with dread. What came next would bind them in ways they couldn't imagine, a twist of fate born from a single sip of tainted water. A month had passed since that hazy night in the South Side bar, and Clara Evans was beginning to feel the weight of it in ways she couldn't ignore. It started with the nausea, a stubborn sickness that hit her every morning as she dragged herself to classes at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Then came the fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee could shake. She was 21, a medical student with a sharp mind and a sharper will, but something was wrong. One quiet afternoon, she slipped into the school's lab, borrowed a test kit from a friend in her anatomy class, and locked herself in a bathroom stall. The 2 pink lines stared back at her, stark and undeniable. Twins. She was pregnant with twins. Her hands shook as she clutched the stick, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't part of the plan, not now, not ever. Clara's mind raced back to that night, the stranger in the motel room, his face blurred by panic and shame. She hadn't known who he was then, but the news had filled in the blanks. James Sullivan, the CEO of Sullivan Industries, the man whose car crash had plastered his name across every TV screen in Chicago. She'd seen the footage of the wreckage on Lakeshore Drive, his dark hair and sharp jaw unmistakable even in grainy stills. That was him, the man who'd pulled her into that corner, the man whose children she was carrying. She didn't want this, didn't want him, but the reality of her life crashed down around her. She couldn't afford a baby, let alone 2. She needed money, fast, to make this go away before it ruined her dreams. She decided to find him, to ask for help, but she couldn't tell Rita. Her mother would kill her if she knew. Back in Southside, Rita's grip on Clara tightened like a vise. The tiny apartment smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke, a prison Clara couldn't escape. Rita had caught wind of a new opportunity, a chance to cash in on her daughter's youth. She had struck a deal with Harold Grayson, a sleazy real estate dealer in his late 50s, who'd made a fortune flipping condemned buildings. He'd seen Clara once delivering water to his office, and his interest had turned into an offer, $50,000 to take her off Rita's hands. "She's a pretty thing," he'd said, his voice oily over the phone. "I'll treat her right." Rita didn't hesitate. She saw dollar signs, not a daughter. When Clara came home from school that day, Rita was waiting, her eyes gleaming with greed. "You're done with that school nonsense," she barked, blocking the door. "Harold's coming tomorrow. You're his now." Clara's stomach dropped. She backed away, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not something you can sell, Mom. I'm not going." Rita's hand shot out, grabbing Clara's arm with bruising force. "You'll do what I say, or you'll wish you were never born." The fight was short and brutal. Clara tried to pull free, but Rita shoved her into her room, slamming the door and locking it from the outside. Clara pounded on the wood, tears streaming down her face. her phone her only lifeline. She texted a friend from UIC, a quiet plea for help, but she knew no one could get here in time. Across the city, in the pristine glow of Gold Coast, James Sullivan was wrestling with his own ghosts. The night at the bar gnawed at him, a blank spot in his memory that wouldn't let go. He'd woken up in that motel alone, his head pounding, his clothes in disarray, and no clue what had happened. It wasn't like him to lose control, and the unease had lingered. He'd asked Tom Reed, his assistant, to dig into it, to talk to the bar owner and figure out where that night had gone wrong. Tom had been reluctant at first, thinking it was just a wild bender, but James insisted. "Something happened, Tom. I need to know." For days, Tom worked the phones, piecing together scraps of gossip from the South Side. That afternoon, Tom burst into James's office, his face flushed with urgency. "Boss, you're not going to believe this. The guy who owns that bar, he says a delivery girl's been asking around about you. She's pregnant, James. Says it's yours." James froze, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. Pregnant? The word hit him like a punch. He didn't remember her, didn't even know her name, but the timeline fit. That night, that damn water bottle. His mind raced, guilt and disbelief warring inside him. "Where is she?" he demanded, already on his feet. Tom hesitated. "South Side. Word is her mom's trouble. She's in deep." James didn't wait for more. He grabbed his keys and told Tom to drive. They found her just in time. Harold Grayson's beat-up sedan was parked outside Clara's building, the man himself banging on the door, yelling for Rita to let him in. Inside, Clara was curled on her bed, her face bruised from Rita's earlier rage, her phone clutched tight as she prayed for a miracle. The sound of tires screeching outside snapped her upright. She peered through the cracked window and saw James storming up the steps, his broad shoulders tense, his eyes blazing. Harold turned, sneering. "Who the hell are you?" James didn't answer. He shoved past him, pounding on the door until Rita opened it, her face twisting in confusion. "Get out of my way," James growled, pushing inside. Clara stumbled out of her room, her breath hitching as she saw him. She didn't know what to say, didn't know why he was here, but the sight of him, real and solid, broke something inside her. "You," she whispered, her voice raw. James's gaze softened for a split second, then hardened as he took in her bruises. "You're coming with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Rita lunged forward, screeching, "She's mine! You can't take her!" James turned on her, his voice cold as steel. "She's not your property. Back off, or I'll make sure you regret it." He took Clara's hand, pulling her out of the apartment, past Harold's stunned glare, and into the SUV. Hours later they were in the Sullivan mansion, a world away from South Side. Clara sat on a plush couch, her hands twisting in her lap, still reeling from the escape. James stood across the room watching her, his mind a storm of questions. Eleanor swept in, her silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, her eyes narrowing at the sight of this ragged girl. "Who is she, James?" she demanded. He took a deep breath, meeting his mother's gaze. "She's pregnant, Mom. With my kids. Twins." Eleanor's skepticism flared. "Some scam, no doubt. Girls like her always want something." But James shook his head. "It's not a scam. I was there that night. I don't remember it, but I know it's true." He insisted on a DNA test, pulling strings to get it done that day. The results came back hours later, confirming what Clara already knew. The twins were his. Eleanor's face shifted, suspicion giving way to a flicker of hope. She looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw not a threat but a lifeline. "Twins?" she murmured, almost to herself. "The Sullivan name will go on." Clara shrank under her stare, overwhelmed. Unsure what this meant for her, James stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here." For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a tiny spark of something she hadn't dared to hope for, a chance. Clara Evans had barely settled into the strange new world of the Sullivan mansion when a storm began brewing beyond its marble walls. It had been a week since James pulled her out of that cramped South Side apartment, away from Rita's fists and Harold Grayson's leering eyes, The Gold Coast estate was a fortress of luxury, with its high ceilings and crystal chandeliers, but Clara felt like an intruder. She sat on the edge of a velvet chair in the living room, her faded jeans a stark contrast to the polished surroundings, her hands fidgeting as she tried to make sense of her new reality. James had been distant but kind, his dark eyes watching her with a mix of guilt and something she couldn't quite name. Eleanor, though, was a different story. The older woman's acceptance came with a price. Constant scrutiny, as if Clara were a project to be molded into something worthy of the Sullivan name. Across Chicago, in the gleaming penthouse of the Pierce family, Vanessa Pierce was seething. At 25, she was the polished daughter of one of the city's wealthiest financial dynasties, her blonde hair always perfect, her smile a weapon she'd honed since childhood. She'd known James Sullivan for years, orbiting him at galas and board meetings, her heart set on a future where she'd stand by his side. The news of his accident had shaken her, but the rumors of Clara, this nobody from Southside carrying his twins, lit a fire of jealousy she couldn't extinguish. She paced her room, heels clicking against the hardwood, her mind racing. "He's mine," she muttered, clenching her fists. "Some street rat isn't going to take him from me." Vanessa wasn't one to sit idle. The moment she heard Clara had moved into the Sullivan mansion, she hired a private investigator, a grizzled man named Vince who knew how to dig up dirt. "Find out everything about her," she'd ordered, tossing a stack of cash across his desk. "I want her gone." Vince worked fast, tailing Clara's every move, digging into her past. It took him 3 days to uncover a bombshell buried in old hospital records. Clara Evans was the biological daughter of the Pierce family, switched at birth during a chaotic night at a Southside clinic 21 years ago. Vanessa, adopted as an infant to replace the lost child, had lived her life as the Pierce heiress, oblivious until now. The revelation hit her like a slap. Not only was Clara stealing James, but she was also the rightful heir to Vanessa's world. Fury turned desperation. Vanessa couldn't let this stand. She needed Clara out of the picture, and she knew just who to call. Rita Evans answered on the first ring, her voice dripping with greed when Vanessa offered $100,000. "Get your daughter back," Vanessa said, her tone icy. "Do whatever it takes to make her disappear. I'll handle the rest." Rita didn't need convincing. The money was more than she'd ever seen, and the chance to drag Clara back into her control was a bonus. "Consider it done," she replied, already plotting. The plan came together quickly. Rita showed up at the Sullivan gates 2 days later, banging on the iron bars, her face twisted with fake tears. "Clara, come out here," she screamed, loud enough to draw a small crowd of curious neighbors. "Your brother's dying, and you're hiding with these rich snobs?" Clara, inside the mansion, froze at the sound of her mother's voice. She'd been in the kitchen, sipping tea Eleanor had forced on her. When the commotion started, James was beside her, his jaw tightening as he listened. "She's lying," Clara whispered, her hands trembling. She'd say anything for money, but doubt gnawed at her. What if it was true? She hadn't seen her brother in months, not since Rita kicked him out for refusing to work. James didn't buy it. He'd had Tom install a tracking app on Clara's phone after the Herald incident, a precaution he hadn't told her about. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll deal with her." But Rita was relentless, her wails growing louder until Clara couldn't take it. "I have to see her," she said, pushing past him. "Just to be sure." James followed, his instincts screaming that this was a trap. Outside, Rita grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her close. "Come home, girl. We need you." Before James could intervene, a van screeched up and 2 men jumped out, shoving Clara inside. Rita smirked as they sped off, counting the cash Vanessa had wired her that morning. They took Clara to a derelict warehouse in West Side, its broken windows and rusted beams a stark contrast to the Gold Coast's shine. She stumbled as they dragged her inside, her heart pounding. Vanessa was waiting, her designer coat absurdly out of place in the grime. "Surprised to see me?" she sneered, stepping forward. Clara's eyes widened. She'd seen Vanessa once at a UIC fundraiser James had dragged her to, a glamorous figure who'd glared at her from across the room. "What do you want?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the fear. Vanessa laughed, cold and sharp. "You're in my way. James, my family, it's all mine. And these," she gestured to Clara's stomach, "they're a problem." Vanessa nodded to a man in the shadows, a hired thug with a syringe in hand. "One shot," she said. "Something to make sure those twins don't see daylight. Quick and clean." Clara's blood ran cold. She backed away, her hands instinctively shielding her belly. "You're insane," she spat, her voice rising. "You'll go to jail for this." Vanessa shrugged. "Money fixes everything. My family's got plenty." The thug advanced, his face blank, the needle glinting in the dim light. Clara lunged for the door, but he grabbed her, pinning her arms as she screamed. James, meanwhile, was already on the move. The moment the van peeled away, he'd pulled up the tracking app, his phone lighting up with Clara's location. "West Side," he muttered, slamming the SUV into gear. Tom rode shotgun, dialing the police as James wove through traffic, his knuckles white on the wheel. He didn't know who was behind this, but he knew Clara was in danger, and that was enough. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking shell against the gray sky. He didn't wait for backup. He kicked the door open, his voice booming through the empty space. "Let her go!" The thug froze, the syringe inches from Clara's arm. Vanessa whirled around, her face paling as James stormed in. "You?" she hissed, stepping between him and Clara. "Stay out of this, James. She's nothing." He didn't flinch. He grabbed the thug's wrist, twisting until the syringe clattered to the floor, then shoved him aside. Clara broke free, running to James, her breath ragged. He pulled her close, his arm a shield around her trembling frame. "She's everything," he said, his voice low and fierce, locking eyes with Vanessa. "You're done." Vanessa's composure cracked, her hands shaking as she backed away. "You don't know what she is," she spat. "She's a Pierce, James, the real one. I found the records. I'm the fake." Her words hung in the air, a twisted confession born of rage. Clara stared, stunned, the pieces falling into place. James tightened his grip on her, his jaw set. "I don't care who she was born to, she's mine now." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as the police closed in. Vanessa's eyes darted to the exit, but there was no escape. Clara clung to James, her mind reeling from Vanessa's words and the near loss of her unborn children. He turned to her, his voice softening. "You're safe. I've got you." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, a mix of relief and fear giving way to something stronger. For the first time, she felt him not just as her rescuer, but as something more, a bond forged in the chaos they'd survived together. The air was thick with tension outside the Sullivan Mansion in Chicago's Gold Coast, the morning sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. Clara Evans stood beside James Sullivan, her hands still trembling from the ordeal in the West Side warehouse just hours ago. The bruises on her arms from Vanessa's hired thug ached, but her resolve held firm. James's arm rested protectively around her shoulders, his dark eyes scanning the street as a familiar figure emerged from a beat-up sedan. Rita Evans stormed toward the iron gates, her wiry frame vibrating with fury, her voice cutting through the quiet neighborhood. "Clara! You ungrateful brat, get out here!" she shouted, her face twisted in a mask of desperation and greed. Clara flinched at the sound, memories of Rita's fists flooding back, but James tightened his grip, anchoring her. "She's not going anywhere," he called out, his tone steady and commanding. Rita ignored him, banging on the gates with both hands. "Her brother's dying in the hospital and she's hiding with you rich bastards. I need money to save him, $1 million. Or he's gone." Her words were a practiced lie, laced with just enough panic to draw a small crowd of onlookers from nearby homes. Clara's heart stuttered. She hadn't seen her brother in months, but the thought of him suffering gnawed at her. "What if she's telling the truth this time?" she whispered, glancing up at James. He shook his head, his jaw tight. "She's playing you. Again." Before Clara could respond, Vanessa Pierce stepped out of a sleek black car parked across the street, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, her expression a mix of defiance and desperation. She'd slipped away from the warehouse before the police arrived, but her composure was fraying. "James, you can't trust her." Vanessa said, striding forward, her voice sharp. She's a liar, just like her mother. Give me a chance to fix this. Clara's stomach twisted. Vanessa's revelation in the warehouse, that she was a Pierce by birth, still echoed in her mind, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't about family ties. It was about survival. James stepped in front of Clara, shielding her from both women. You've done enough, Vanessa. Back off. But Rita wasn't finished. She lunged at the gate, rattling it with a snarl. You owe me, Clara. I raised you, fed you, and now you're throwing me away for him? Give me the money, or I'll make sure everyone knows what a selfish little wretch you are. The accusation stung, but Clara straightened, finding her voice. You never raised me, you used me. And my brother's not dying, is he? You just want cash. The standoff might have dragged on, fueled by Rita's venom and Vanessa's spite, but a new figure emerged from the crowd. It was Dr. Sarah Klein, a friend from Clara's UIC classes, her white coat crisp despite the early hour. She held a folder in her hands, her expression calm but resolute. I heard the commotion, Sarah said, stepping forward. I checked on your brother, Clara. He's in a clinic downtown, not a hospital, it's just the flu. Here's the record. She handed the folder to James, who flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he turned to Rita. Flu, not dying. You're done lying your way into her life. Rita's face crumpled, her bluff exposed, but she doubled down, screeching, You can't prove that! I need that money! Vanessa seized the moment, her voice rising. See, James? They're trash, both of them. Let me handle this. I'll make it right for you. Clara glared at her, anger overtaking fear. You tried to kill my babies, Vanessa. You don't get to talk about right. The crowd murmured, heads turning as the weight of her words sank in. Before Vanessa could retort, 2 police cars rolled up, their lights flashing silently. Officers stepped out, followed by a man and woman in tailored suits. Richard and Helen Pierce, Vanessa's parents, or rather, her adoptive parents. Richard's face was stern, Helen's eyes red with unshed tears. They'd been called by James's assistant, Tom, who dug up the DNA results after Vanessa's confession in the warehouse. Richard approached, his voice low but firm. Vanessa, it's over. We know the truth. Clara's our daughter, our real daughter. You've been lying to us, to everyone. Helen clutched her husband's arm, her gaze shifting to Clara with a mix of awe and regret. We lost you 21 years ago, she said softly. A mix-up at the hospital. We didn't know until now. Clara's breath caught, the revelation hitting her like a wave. She'd always felt out of place with Rita, but this was too much. Vanessa laughed bitterly, stepping back. So what? You're choosing her over me? I'm the one who's been your daughter all these years. Richard shook his head. You kidnapped her, Vanessa. You nearly killed her. We can't protect you anymore. The officers moved in, cuffing Vanessa as she struggled, her screams echoing down the street. This isn't fair. I did it for us, she yelled, her perfect facade shattering. Rita tried to slip away, but James blocked her path, his voice cold. You're not walking out of this. You sold your own daughter. Take what you've got and leave Chicago. He pulled out his phone, transferring $18,000 to her account, the minimum spousal support allowed under Illinois law if they'd been married. It was a final cut, a legal slap to send her packing. Rita snatched her phone, glaring, but the fight drained out of her as she saw the police watching. You'll regret this, she muttered, turning away, disappearing into the crowd. The chaos settled, leaving Clara standing with James, the Pierces, and a stunned audience of neighbors. Richard approached her, his voice gentle. We want you in our lives, Clara, if you'll have us. Helen nodded, tears spilling over. We've missed so much already. Clara hesitated, overwhelmed, but James squeezed her hand, grounding her. You don't have to decide now, he said quietly, but you're not alone anymore. She nodded, a fragile smile breaking through her exhaustion. The Pierces stepped back, giving her space, their hope palpable. James turned to Clara, the crowd fading into the background. This has been hell, he said, his voice softening, but it's over. You're free. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and saw something new, not just protection, but a promise. The weight of the morning lifted slightly, and she felt a spark of courage. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, her voice trembling but sure, "but I want to find out. With you." He smiled, a rare, genuine curve of his lips, and pulled her closer. Later that afternoon, with the police gone and the Pierces waiting for her answer, James drove Clara to Millennium Park. The city buzzed around them, but the park was a pocket of calm, its silver bean sculpture glinting in the sunlight. They stood by the edge of the fountain, the sound of water mingling with distant laughter. James took her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "I've been running from everything since that crash," he said, his voice low. "But you, Clara, you've made me stop. I want this, us, you and the twins. Marry me." He pulled a simple silver ring from his pocket, nothing flashy, just solid and real. Clara's breath caught, tears welling up as she stared at the ring, then at him. She'd never imagined this, not with her past, not with Rita's shadow. But James was here, steady and unwavering, offering her a future she'd never dared to dream of. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her into his arms, and for the first time Clara felt like she belonged somewhere, with someone who saw her, truly saw her. The dust had barely settled from the confrontation outside the Sullivan mansion, but Clara Evans felt a quiet shift in the air as she stood with James Sullivan by her side. The chaos of the morning, with Rita's lies and Vanessa's arrest, faded into a distant hum, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. The Gold Coast sun climbed higher, warming the manicured lawn where just hours ago her past had tried to claw her back. Now, with James' hand in hers and the simple silver ring glinting on her finger, Clara dared to believe in something better. She was still reeling from his proposal at Millennium Park, his words echoing in her mind. "Marry me." She'd said yes, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like a trap. 2 weeks later, the Holy Name Cathedral stood tall against Chicago's skyline, its Gothic spires piercing the crisp autumn sky. Clara walked down the aisle in a modest white dress, nothing extravagant, just soft lace that hugged her growing belly. The twins were 5 months along now, a subtle curve she cradled with one hand as she moved. James waited at the altar, his dark suit sharp and his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. The guest list was small, just Eleanor Sullivan, beaming with a pride Clara hadn't expected, and Richard and Helen Pierce, her newly found parents, who sat in the front pew with tentative smiles. They'd reached out after the confrontation, offering her a place in their lives. And though Clara hadn't fully embraced it yet, their presence here felt like a start. The ceremony was simple, the priest's voice steady as he spoke of love and commitment. Clara's hands trembled as she repeated her vows, her voice catching on to have and to hold. James's grip was firm, his own words clear and unwavering. "I promise to stand by you, to protect you, and to build a life with you and our children." When he slid a matching silver band onto her finger, sealing the promise from the park, Clara felt tears slip down her cheek. They weren't tears of fear or pain, not this time, but of a joy she'd never thought possible. The small crowd clapped as they kissed, a brief, tender press of lips that carried the weight of everything they'd survived. Afterward, the reception was held in the Sullivan Mansion's garden, a quiet affair with string lights and a handful of tables. Eleanor approached Clara, her silver hair catching the glow of the evening, and pressed a gentle hand to her shoulder. "Your family now," she said, her voice warm with a sincerity that surprised Clara. "Those twins, they're our future." Clara nodded, still adjusting to the idea of belonging here. Richard and Helen joined them, Helen holding out a small velvet box. "It's not much," she said, opening it to reveal a delicate necklace with a tiny pearl. "It was meant for you, all those years ago." Clara took it, her throat tight, and whispered a thank you, the gesture bridging a gap she hadn't known how to cross. As the night wore on, James pulled Clara aside, away from the chatter and the clinking glasses. "You've been through hell," he said, his voice low, his hand resting on her cheek. "But it's over now. We're starting fresh." She leaned into his touch, feeling the steadiness she'd come to rely on. "I never thought I'd get here," she admitted, her eyes tracing his face. "Not with you, not like this." He smiled, that rare curve of his lips she was learning to love. "Good thing I'm stubborn," he teased, and she laughed, the sound light and free. A few days later, life settled into a new rhythm. Clara moved into James's wing of the mansion, her textbook spread across a desk he'd set up for her. She was determined to finish her medical degree after the twins were born, and James had promised to make it happen, hiring tutors to keep her on track. One evening, as the city lights twinkled beyond the windows, Clara felt a familiar craving kick in. "BBQ," she said, turning to James with a grin. "From Lou Malnati's, the one in South Side. I used to dream about it when I was broke." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "You're 5 months pregnant, and you want BBQ at 8 o'clock? She nodded, unapologetic. "Blame the twins." He didn't argue. He grabbed his keys, and soon they were in his SUV, cutting through the city toward South Side. Lou Malnati's was a hole-in-the-wall joint, its neon sign buzzing as they stepped inside. The smell of smoked meat and tangy sauce hit Clara like a wave, and she sighed, content. They ordered a platter to go, ribs and brisket piled high, and sat in the car to eat, the windows cracked to let in the cool night air. James handed her a rib, watching as she took a bite, sauce smudging her chin. "You're a mess," he said, chuckling, and wiped it away with a napkin. She grinned, unembarrassed. "You signed up for this." They ate in comfortable silence, the city humming around them, a far cry from the chaos that had defined their start. James reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "This is us now," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "You, me, and soon them." He nodded toward her belly, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her, deeper than the food or the night. She squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Yeah," she agreed, "this is us." Back at the mansion, they curled up on the couch, the BBQ wrappers tossed aside, the future stretching out before them. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, the weight of her past finally lifting. She'd come from nothing, fought through everything, and now she had this: a family, a love, a life. James kissed her forehead, a silent promise that he'd be there, always. And as the city lights glowed beyond the windows, Clara knew she'd found her place, not just in Chicago, but with him.